art, science and culture. The documentary from the BBC World Service tells the world's stories. Search for The Documentary wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Inquiry. I'm Charmaine Cozier. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses and an answer. January the 19th, 2023. More than 1 million people are protesting across France. Members of the country's biggest unions are also on strike. Uncollected plastic bags of rubbish spill out of overflowing bins onto the streets. Public transport is disrupted. Schools are closed. 4 months later, the civil unrest continues. Protesters and police clash. Public buildings are targeted. A state visit by the British monarch, King Charles III, is postponed. The demonstrations stem from a government plan to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, so people would work and pay into the pension system for longer. There's also concern about what that change might mean for those who are many decades away from pension age. France isn't the only country facing economic efficiency challenges as populations age and leave the labour market. So this week we're asking, will Europe's young workers have to pay more for the old?
Part 1. The trade-off.
The younger workers are the ones who feel that they're being ripped off.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is a French columnist for the Telegraph newspaper. She's based in Paris.
Life expectation in France has soared, and in 1945 we had 8 people at work paying for 1 pensioner, and nowadays we've got under 2 people at work paying for 1 pensioner.
In France, the mandatory state pension is paid out of a common fund. Workers pay into it through a payroll tax called Social Security contributions. It works alongside other wage deductions.
The trade-off is that taxes are quite high in France. We're the most taxed citizens of the European Union. But we get for this good social services. We get good national health. We get good schools. We get good roads. We get good trains. In the past, I should say 2 decades, these things have started not being so good. And there's this sort of growing disappointment that this huge machine of the French state is no longer so efficient.
That growing disappointment also features in the protests.
It's very complicated. Essentially, of course, it's about pension age. It's also about the lack of trust in the French state, and that's an important thing to understand about France. The French have got this sort of really serious relationship with their state that other nations don't quite have. And we don't like especially the state, but we trust the state to give us an extremely good social coverage and to protect us, basically.
And that public trust includes a long-standing expectation that decades spent in tough and sometimes harsh working conditions will be worth it.
By and large, the workplace in France is unpleasant. French organizations are heavily political inside, by which I mean internal politics, not political politics. And they're mostly based on hierarchy, with the boss being always right. The atmosphere is very often poisonous. And the result is people do not enjoy their jobs. And all of this is part of the idea that this is the trade-off. I work in unpleasant circumstances and I do work hard, but the end of my life is going to be a bit nicer. I'm not just going to drop dead after having toiled all my life.
In January, the pension bill that would extend working life in France by 2 more years went before Parliament, and the first protest erupted.
The people you saw demonstrating, especially in the first 2 months, were people who felt that they were bearing the creation of the money that then would be paid back in benefits and pensions on their own. I would say that the protests are young people, the working poor, a kind of middle class, and well-off young people as well. And the people who are not protesting, who are Macron's natural voters, are pensioners, people who already pensioners, are people who are so close to their pension that their own fate is not going to be affected by the law.
In March, President Macron narrowly survived a no-confidence vote in Parliament. In a recent TV interview, there were no signs of a U-turn. He said the bill needed to be law by the end of this year, and it was necessary to avoid future pension fund deficits as the population ages.
His reasons are perfectly reasonable reasons. He says we must balance the system. It's going to be unsustainable. And he also says that France has got a huge budget deficits every year and huge debt. And incidentally, the bill might sort of, top up the pension system by something like 12 to 18 billion euros. So it's a drop in the ocean of French debt.
President Macron used special constitutional powers to push the contested bill through without a full parliamentary vote. After the country's constitutional court reviewed and approved key parts of the reform, it was signed into law. Events in France show that balancing national finances while trying to keep workers and retirees relatively happy is an economic challenge, and one that many other countries are more than familiar with.
Part 2. The Elephant in the Room.
United Kingdom, but also in the United States, also in advanced countries in Asia, and even emerging economies like China, for example, showing now quite a bit of slowdown in terms of productivity growth. Now, there's not a single reason for that. There are multiple reasons.
And they include investment cutbacks or the time delay between a business adding new technology to improve productivity and seeing the results of those changes. Economies can grow when staff numbers expand, but in many countries the employment pool is shrinking on all sides.
The big elephant in the room in this story is that even though productivity has always been the most important driver of economic growth, it probably is even more important now than ever before. And that is because the other engine, which is adding more working hours, is actually slowing. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there are just fewer people available to work,
which reduces the hours available to drive economic growth. Some people are choosing to cut back for a better work-life balance, while others are retiring.
And even though we are increasing the pension age quite substantially in many Western economies, we still see that many people see opportunities to leave the workforce relatively early. And that is, of course, making the number of people who are in work relative to the number of people who are not in work quite a bit smaller. And that puts even more pressure on the productivity of those people who are still in the workforce. And we see that the increase in pension ages has really gone up slowly, and many countries are moving on it. France, for example, much slower than in other countries, but in all countries see this trend going up. But surprisingly, I also find that a lot of companies are very slow in realizing this. There's still very much a mindset in many companies that it is actually okay if when people are, say, 60, that they try to look for retirement, and that by 65, most of them will be gone, instead of thinking about the fact that actually we may need those people. We should use them much better, and we should try to make it attractive for older people to stay in the workforce rather than to sort of edge them towards the exit.
Over time, that's not sustainable.
The problem is that if we don't make full usage of all those healthy people, that we put too much pressure on the people who are still in the workforce to be even more productive, to the point that it is really not possible. So we have to think about all the workforce, even if they're somewhat less productive than younger people, we should still make good use of them.
Even small changes can make a difference to productivity.
One good example of this is that for all the people who have to do physical demanding work, whether they are in production workers or health workers who have to do heavy lifting, we now have a lot of devices where people can be supported in their back so that they don't get back problems. We have to think harder about better vision devices for all the workers. So there are lots of opportunities where technology could actually play quite an important role.
Technology could also help by taking on the mundane and low productivity parts of a job.
There's also a great opportunity for new technologies such as artificial intelligence or robotics that can take over the more tedious parts of jobs, allowing the human worker to actually do the things that they're really good at. Opportunities that companies quite often miss in making all the workers more productive is because they're not using technology opportunities to the full. And again, all the workers can add real value, because what is the value of all the workers? Well, they have a lot of experience. Companies are underestimating how important these older workers can be for them to go forward.
As for how to keep newer workers engaged and efficient, Bart van Ark says it's crucial that employers fully understand what productivity should look like.
Many people think of productivity as, stress and potential burnout and too much work pressure. But frankly, if that happens, it means that an organization is not very productive because it's using their people in the wrong way. So for organizations who really invest in making their place a more productive and a better place to work, will be the organizations that will be able to attract young workers to be with them. Productive organizations are organizations that work very well, that use their resources as good as possible, that equips young people with the right technologies, that lets them to work together so that they're kind of enjoying the work that they are doing together. So making the workplace an attractive place to work is important. Young workers are a critical part to the productivity story because they bring in the latest skills. They are the people who are sort of in the most active years of their lives. So they're incredibly valuable for organizations. They're creative. They're willing to move things forward. But it would be a big mistake to think that people who are older than 50 or 55 are not adding further value to an organization. And therefore, it's absolutely critical to make work something attractive for people of older age to do.
Productivity slowdowns are proving inescapable for many economies. The impact is more severe in some places than others. So how's it affecting the younger end of the labour market in two of the countries which share borders with France?
Part 3. Spain.
Marcel Janssen is an associate professor in economics at the Autonomous University of Madrid.
There are some reforms being made that could improve things, but so far, young people have a very, very tough entry into the Spanish labour market.
It's something that worries his students.
Since most of my students are bilingual, my suggestion is that they should either try to find a job abroad or try to work for multinational firms in Spain, because those firms tend to offer better conditions than Spanish firms. It's a rather grim picture, right? It takes even my best students a very long time to flow into stable and well-paid jobs. This is not a problem restricted, say, to uneducated or low-educated people. It's a deep structural problem.
There are three main reasons why newer job seekers struggle to find work in Spain.
The first reason is a rather dysfunctional labour market, a labour market that is extremely segmented between highly protected permanent jobs and unprotected temporary jobs.
Permanent jobs and the employment rights that go with them have typically been out of reach. Younger people were more likely to end up on short-term contracts, making it easier and cheaper for employers to hire and fire them.
Second reason, and that's a deeper cause, is the weak link between the education system in Spain and the labour market. Typically, 1/3 of youth entered the labour market with no more than mandatory education, and many of them were attracted into the labour market because of well-paid jobs in the construction sector, but they've all disappeared. And then third, what is a distinctive feature of Spain is that youth hardly acquires any work experience before they finish their studies. So essentially their working careers start when their education ends.
And that lack of workplace knowledge creates a disadvantage in a competitive job market.
The result is the highest or second highest youth unemployment rate in Europe. It's currently at about 30%. But to give you an idea, at the worst point of the global financial crisis, youth unemployment rates almost reached 60%.
There have been youth employment-friendly government measures. In December 2021, a labour market reform tightened the rules around temporary contracts and made it easier to access permanent jobs.
So what we have seen in the last 14 months is a severe drop in the share of temporary jobs. It hovered around 23% before the reform, and right now it's down to 15%, which is more or less the European average.
There were also significant changes to pay.
The minimum wage has increased by about 40%. Since many of the young workers are on minimum wage jobs, at least those who retain their jobs have seen their wages increase substantially.
It's still too early to know what those changes will do for productivity because other factors remain to put the brakes on growth. Spain has one of the longest average lifespans in the world. It's around 83 years.
The cohorts of young people are shrinking, but within, let's say, the period between now and 2050, this is going to be the country with the eldest population in Europe and the highest ratio of elderly people to young people.
Spain has its own pension reforms. Lawmakers recently approved plans to increase contributions for businesses and higher earners. Overhauling the system was among conditions attached in order to receive billions of euros in post-pandemic recovery funds from the European Union.
And one of the measures that is introduced in the reform is an automatic indexation of pensions to inflation rates. And one of the first consequences of that measure was that pensions have risen last year by more than 8%, whereas wages have risen by not much more than 2.5% on average, meaning that the burden of the pension system is increasing.
And younger generations will shoulder most of that.
Somehow I think they believe that when current pension system is guaranteed, then their future pension entitlements are also guaranteed. What they fail to recognize is that they will have to pay substantially higher social security contributions and taxes over the next 40 years. And their future pension entitlements are not going to increase at par. That means that they have to make a much higher contribution, net contribution to the pension system than previous generations, but awareness of this is very low.
That might explain why mass demonstrations like those across the border in France haven't happened. Or maybe they're busy with more immediate concerns.
Yes, I think right now the main problem of youth is getting a decent salary, being able to find affordable housing, being able to make family decisions. Young people who want to form a family and who can't because they don't have access to housing or they're afraid of losing their job. So in a sense, the horizon of young people is probably way too short at the moment to care about pensions. So it's the role of experts and the role also of governments to protect youth who may underestimate the challenges that they face.
Part 4. Germany.
What Germany has done right in terms of youth employment is continuously investing both in academic education but also in technical vocational education.
Stefano Scarpita is Director for Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD. In contrast to Spain, Germany's education system and labour market are closely linked through apprenticeship programmes.
For example, 46% of upper secondary students in Germany have a vocational education and a training title, and most of them actually are apprentices. And this leads to a very high level of employment amongst those who complete technical vocational education, which is about 88%, much higher than what we find in other countries.
And that all feeds through into increased productivity.
Germany is a high manufacturing country and they need a lot of people with high level technical vocational education. So this is certainly something that contributes to the strong productivity growth compared to other countries in Germany, in particular in the manufacturing sector.
Apprenticeships span a range of industries, including agriculture and the service sector.
This dual education system, the combination of academic with technical vocational education, has been in Germany for a very long time. It's a long tradition. It's actually very well respected by everyone. So the employer really value the fact that they can train some of the young people during the education period. And actually many of those who complete an apprenticeship program, technical vocational education, get hired by the same company where they've done the on-the-job learning process. In fact, the German experience suggests, and is similar in countries like Switzerland, in Austria, in the Nordic countries of Europe, that people completing technical vocational education have a very smooth transition into a job, even though they might not have the same career progression of those completing tertiary education with a more academic learning.
So what makes it work so well?
One is the quality of the technical education system itself. Second are the close link between the curricula in technical vocational education and what actually the employer needs. And third, which is related to that, is also the fact that the employer themselves highly value young people going to technical vocational education. There is this perception that in order to succeed in the labor market, for the parents, the children have to go all the way to tertiary level of education. Okay, so there is a lot to be done to remove the stigma against the technical vocational education, to work with the parents, to work with the students, but also ensure that the quality of technical vocational education is high, because of course that's an important element to overcome this stigma and this perception that technical vocational education is not a good investment for the future of the young people.
Highly skilled young workers are in international demand, however, which could damage the productivity prospects of the countries which have paid to skill them up.
Now, of course, there is much more to be done to narrow the productivity gap and to continue to boost productivity. And Germany is not completely immune from this sort of perception against technical vocational education. If we look at the numbers, the number of apprentices has declined in Germany. It remains very high compared to many other OECD countries, but has been declining. So there is a continuous need to upgrade and adapt the curricula to make sure that we keep a close link with the employers, what the employers need. The young generation are mobile, so they can actually be more willing to move from one country to the other. But in my view, this should not be a reason not to invest heavily on education and actually on adult training as well, because that's one of the key drivers of economic growth, but also of inclusivity in the labor market. We are facing almost a paradoxical situation because we have the best generation enter the labor market, and yet for some of them it's quite difficult to get a foothold into the labor market. So we need to invest in creating productive and rewarding jobs so that we would actually retain them into the country.
So will Europe's young workers have to pay more for the old? Workers of all ages fund state pensions, so in a way that's always been the case. However, more people are living for much longer with not enough workers coming through to replace them. Younger workers face paying higher contributions and longer working lives in order to keep pension funds topped up. As we've heard from our expert witnesses, opportunities to maximise the productivity potential of near-retirement workers to ease the burden on younger colleagues shouldn't be overlooked by employers. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier, and produced by Phil Revell. The researcher was Anushka Matanda Dougherty, editor Tara McDermott, and technical producer Nikki Edwards.